we also have another story this week out of Texas that has to do with Beto O'Rourke. Right, he's back in the news again. Is that right?
Yep. Beto O'Rourke was doing a campaign stop, and long story short, he was asked about his position on guns by someone in the crowd, and he totally reversed course from his infamous statement. Backed away from saying that, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, and it turns out, I guess he's not so bananas about that idea now that he's facing the electoral reality of trying to run a statewide race in Texas.
Yeah, he said specifically, and here's the quote, "I'm not interested in taking anything from anyone. What I want to make sure that we do is defend the Second Amendment," which is obviously a very stark reversal from what he had said during the Democratic presidential primary back in 2019, where he said, quote, "Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. So the contrast between those two quotes is pretty remarkable, honestly. And I think more than anything, though, it's the timing of this reversal, because I think a lot of people would argue that he was going to have to reverse himself on this if he wanted to have a chance of winning the governorship in Texas, of all places.
Right.
But for whatever reason, that's not the strategy they went with at first. When he announced in November, and we covered this and talked about it on the podcast as well, he doubled down on confiscating AR-15s. You know, he came out and said that he stood by those comments. And then later in November, he doubled down again saying, quote, "The AR-15, or that AR-15, that AK-47 has one single solitary purpose, and that is killing people as effectively and efficiently in as great a number in as little time as possible. We saw that in Kenosha. We saw that in El Paso, Texas, where 23 people were murdered by someone with an AK-47 just in a matter of minutes. This is crazy, and we should not come to expect this as a matter of course in America. And the thing is, we don't have to." That's what he told CNN when he announced right after he announced his campaigns. It's like not only saying, yes, I stand by the idea, but doubling down on it. His argument is that there was no legitimate use for AR-15s or AK-47s, which happen to be, by the way, the most popular rifles in America. And so going from that argument that these have no legitimate purpose and should not be owned by anyone, and if you own them now, you should have to give them in or face severe consequences. He had talked about this back in 2019 that, you know, people who don't turn in the guns in this mandatory buyback that he was talking about, there would be law enforcement consequences for them. And now he's saying he doesn't want to take anything from anybody. And it's just kind of odd, you know. We did see, I guess, at one point in December, right, there was some polling on this, at least on the gun issue.
I was just going to say, I think that might just speak to a little bit of this reversal in course, because not only did he double down in November about his stance on AR-15s, but he also took shots at Greg Abbott on his what he called gun extremism right. Gun laws. But as you said, we saw in a poll among voters in Texas that 60% of people actually prefer Greg Abbott on gun policy, whereas only 33% of voters in Texas said the same for O'Rourke. So perhaps he's sort of reading the tea leaves and kind of adjusting course.
Right. Right. A 27-point gap there is pretty substantial. Right. And he's trailing significantly to Abbott overall in head-to-head polling, you know, somewhere between 10 and 15 points generally, which is not exactly a promising picture being painted of Beto's chances to win this election. But and certainly when your gun policy is that much lower, that's probably one of the driving points between why he's doing so poorly overall. But you know, and yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue, right, that he doubled down and then he saw the poll numbers, but and maybe they have some internal polling as well that show this is going over poorly, in addition to what we've seen publicly. Right. But I mean, who couldn't have seen that coming though? That's my thing about it. Like,
right.
I don't, you know,
it's almost political malpractice, you know, and what's even more noticeable, it's not even the general yet. You'd expect maybe a little bit of a pivot once the general comes, but he's still in the Democratic primary stage of this, where you typically see a little more of a stronger stance on Democratic priorities. And the fact that he's coming to the center like this before even obtaining the candidacy is pretty remarkable, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's just such a weird strategy. I wrote about this in a members piece over at thereload.com, but it's the timing of it is so weird. If you're going to make, I think everyone expected he'd have to make this reversal. Yeah, like you said, maybe the normal time to do it would be either before you launch the campaign or when you launch it, or when you get through the primary and make it to the general. Now, to be fair, I guess the primary is maybe not that competitive in Texas for the Democratic nomination for governor right now, but so maybe he's already got that locked up pretty well because McConaughey didn't run, so there's not a lot of other high-profile challengers at the very least. But doubling down and then a couple months later completely reversing yourself, and especially in such stark terms like that. Now he's about defending the Second Amendment instead of taking people's guns. Okay. Now, I mean, to be fair, he did this in a response to a question, so it's perhaps not a prepared line on his part that might explain some of the awkwardness of the incredible contrast there between those two statements. But the whole thing is just bizarre. I mean, Adam Serwer was on the podcast a couple months back in October, so really before Beto even launched his campaign, and we had talked about this because Adam's he writes for the Atlantic and he lives down in Texas now, and he and I predicted that he was gonna probably have to change his position on this, and then what it boils down to now is perhaps not even whether people will believe him. Right. I mean, I guess that's a question, but will anyone really buy that reversal? I don't know. But the bigger question is whether or not voters will care that much about it. Maybe they don't buy it, but they don't care because they think Beto is still going to be better than Abbott for other issues that they find more important to them. That would be the calculation here, or the way that this doesn't just completely tank his campaign. But to me, it's going to be very difficult for him to come back from. This is one of his most famous statements of all time in his whole political career. He made it it's ironic in a way because he's reversing himself now. And I think most people looking from the outside believe that that's to try and help his political chances in this Texas race. But the reason he went all in and said, hell yeah, we're going to take your AK-47s and your AR-15s, it was a political ploy. He had entered that presidential primary as with a ton of hype, and he was leading in the polls very early on in that race. And then as other candidates got in, his star faded a lot, and as he became a bottom tier candidate. And so by that September debate of 2019, where he made this declaration, he was trying to kickstart his campaign. He was trying to get attention for himself. He was trying to bring his poll numbers back up. And so that's why he did this in the first place. That's why he made this confiscation declaration, right? But it didn't work. He actually polled worse after doing that than before doing it. And at one point, he even fell all the way to 0% in a USA Today poll. And then he dropped out less than 2 months after making the declaration. So that was one of the weird things about this Texas race, is that he didn't immediately try to backtrack on this. Now he's backtracking in hopes of raising his political chances again by taking the opposite position or taking some position. To be honest with you, we don't really know what he actually thinks about the guns. Now, if you check his campaign website and you look at the gun section under issues, he's still talking about taking AR-15s and AK-47s off the streets, but he just doesn't have any sort of policy proposal connected to it. And so he's clearly going to focus more on attacking Abbott about permitless carry, like you mentioned there. Because he called him an extremist, right?
Yeah, he called it gun extremism. He said it endangers public safety. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if he can form maybe a coherent gun policy now after this massive reversal. Like you said, there's no clear-cut policy.
Right. I reached out to his campaign to see if they had details on exactly why he reversed himself, in his own words, at least, and then what his new policy actually is. I imagine he still supports an assault weapons ban, but probably a more traditional one that bans, sales and doesn't try to confiscate ones already owned by people. That the one that has a grandfather clause, in other words, which is what everyone else is. That's what all the current laws have, more or less.
Sure.
To one degree or another, but I don't know. I guess maybe he's more in line because it's weird to go out and try to say that Abbott's a gun extremist while you're holding the most extreme gun policy position on the left. Like this was so extreme. You don't even see the gun control groups jumping into this. You haven't seen anything from the gun control groups saying that they agree with Beto. The major ones, Everytown, Giffords, they're not on. They don't seem to be on board with this. I think they're probably embarrassed by it to some degree because it kind of undercuts a lot of what they argue, right? Which is that nobody is coming to take your guns, that they just want these different gun safety proposals, universal background checks, bans on new sales, those sorts of things, liability for gun manufacturers. And obviously, as anyone listening to this podcast knows, there's quite a lot of debate over all of those policies and whether they're good or bad, and whether they accomplish what they set out to. But I think it's generally the case that most gun control advocates argue that they don't want to take your guns. And so you have Beto out there undermining all of that as a major national figure in the Democratic Party saying, yes, I do want to take your guns. Perhaps now he's more in line with what the orthodoxy is on the left, on the mainstream left on guns, at least now. And he's maybe, I don't know, maybe it's more in line now to say, oh, Abbott's the actual extremist because I don't believe in taking guns anymore. But I don't know how many people are going to buy into that who weren't already going to vote for him.